suggesting a very old left sensibility, if I may. Okay, it is 4 p.m. and let's get started. Good afternoon to those of you watching live, and good whatever time it is to those of you looking at this later. I'm Harold Meyerson. I am the editor-at-large of the American Prospect, a left-of-center magazine that's been around for 30 years, founded by Robert Reich, Bob Kuttner, and Paul Starr. And today, we are having an Angelino hour. We are discussing a brand new, terrific work of history, a wonderful book called Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s, from the Jim Morrison song of the Doors, kind of the, white LA band of the 60s. Jon Wiener is a emeritus historian at the University of California at Irvine, a noted historian who's covered cultural and movement history for some time. Mike Davis probably needs no introduction, but we'll get one anyway. Mike is the author of the great documented impressionistic work on Los Angeles, City of Quartz, and many other works. Both these guys are essential figures in LA over the last many years, and essential figures in documenting what has gone on in a city that is not often thought of as a center of left ferment, more as a center perhaps of left disorder, but we're going to deal with that. And we will be joined, excuse me, a little later by a leading activist in today's movements, Melina Abdullah, who's the head of the Pan-African Studies Department at Cal State University, Los Angeles, and more importantly, I think, or more germanely, I should say, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, and really one of the shapers of the whole Black Lives Matter movement nationally. Well, let's get started with, again, this book. Verso Press put it out. We'll talk about this and other related issues for the next hour. And we're talking on a day that is an anniversary, the 55th anniversary of the Watts uprising of 1965, an event where the young Mike Davis was in and around, and the even younger 15-year-old Harold Meyerson, me, was also in LA, albeit in a kind of upper middle class left version of that. I was, the second night, I was at the Greek Theater where my lifelong socialist parents had taken me to hear Harry Belafonte in an outdoor amphitheater, the Greek Theater. And as the sky lit up, Belafonte, who like Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee and Lena Horne, was one of the real militants of the civil rights movement, the Black liberation movement of the 1950s and 60s and beyond, and a real radical, and he still is, was giving kind of ongoing commentary, a very safe but fascinating way to have third-hand, fourth-hand, or fifth-hand experienced that, which I did. But Mike will be talking about what he and John have basically documented and reported on and done interviews with leading up to this. And let's begin talking about what is, was an overriding issue then and is an overriding issue now, which is the police. And of course, Los Angeles police now, particularly if you look back in its history, have become kind of stereotyped, but correctly, as a racist, oppressive army of occupation. That's pretty much how they define themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the LAPD and how it fit and didn't fit, not only into minority communities in Los Angeles back then, but into the city as a whole. I want to begin with that and how that was part of the groundwork for what laid the basis for this uprising. Mike, you want to talk some about that?
In 1936, or maybe it was 37, a book appeared written by an investigative journalist on America's out of control police. And at the top of the list were the LAPD. And LA was described as a city where the US Constitution effectively didn't exist. And one of the reasons the police were so violent and out of control, far more important than the corruption that existed, is that they had become basically the official Pinkertons for the open shop in Los Angeles. LA was the birthplace of the open shop, created by a group called the Merchants and Manufacturers Association, essentially.
And just to clarify, open shop means no unions and doing anything to stamp them out.
Open shop in LA not only meant no unions, it meant no civil liberties and a massive repression of protest of all kinds of free speech. In other words, the LAPD were kind of goons for the LA employers, whose generalissimo was Norman Chandler, the proprietor of the LA Times. And this was an organization that businessmen had no choice on joining. If you didn't belong to the M&M, you could be in trouble. You could end up being boycotted. Banks might not give you loans. So the city was organized industrially by its elites on an almost paramilitary basis.
And then this group kind of evolved under the notorious police chief William Parker, who took over the force in 1950, and talk about its relation to minority communities, of which LA had many, particularly the African American community.
Parker joined the police force, I believe, in 1927, and he earned a law degree at night and became head of the Fire and Policemen's Benevolent League, I think it was called. But he was responsible for two reforms. One was, in the name of fighting corruption, to make the office of police chief virtually a lifelong sinecure, could only be deposed by a vote at the city council. And at the same time, succeeded in passing another resolution that became part of the new LA City Charter that said that investigations of police abuse, police misconduct would be conducted by the Internal Affairs Division of the LAPD and no one else. During the war, he played a prominent role in administrating martial law after the invasion of France and later in Germany. And martial law became his favorite model or mode of administration when he took over the department in 1950. The department had already undergone a year of reform under a Marine general who imposed on the department a whole new training system based on the Marines, and who favored hiring Marines. And Parker took over this. And in the 1950s, the department became less corrupt, although there's still, of course, corruption. But Parker riveted intensely on ensuring segregation in Los Angeles, sometimes in the most absurd ways. For instance, when we were teenagers, Harold, we were probably listening to the radio broadcast from Dolphins of Hollywood, the kind of Vatican City of rhythm and blues in LA. Parker in the 50s, because it was so popular with white musicians and white kids. Dolphins wasn't actually in Hollywood. It was, I think, near Vernon and Central, that he put up a police cordon around Dolphins. Black customers could go in and out, but if white kids showed up and musicians to buy records, they were accosted, sometimes searched and frisked, and basically told to stay out of the area. So that's why the chapter on Parker in our book calls him the warden of the ghetto, because that was exactly his role.
You know, along with your 1936 book that you reference, in the book, The Making of the President 1960, Theodore White's hagiographic account of John Kennedy's election as president, he notes in a scene where Kennedy arrives at LAX on the eve of the Democratic Convention, something we're about to have again now, sort of. And he notes that someone in the crowd seemed to be a little berserk, but that he was held back by the LA police, which Theodore White, who has no particular interest or take in these matters, says perhaps the most efficient, but also the most brutal police force in the country. Just as an aside, in a book that he's not really covering that as an issue, but this showed to me just how the reputation was already there, And then, I mean, this is referring to the LAPD, according to Teddy White, who, again, who has no particular, issue he wants to deal with here, just as in passing. But, so this collides with the growth of the African-American community, the confinement, since they can't move out of a relatively small neighborhood, and the fact that by the mid-1960s, as this book documents, the economy is booming and Blacks are excluded from huge numbers of jobs. And that's going on right at the height of the economic prosperity of the 1960s. So what's the experience in South Central leading up to the uprising?
Well, first let me note that the Kennedys were friends with Chief Parker.
Yes.
Parker was a Catholic, and Parker thought he had the inside track to supplant J. Edgar Hoover as head of the FBI. And then Hoover, of course, resorted to his famous files and had a secret meeting with Bobby Kennedy. And after that, there was no chance Parker was going to take place. They hated...
Which seems to be exactly what Parker did with Mayor Yorty, making sure that he didn't criticize him since he had a file on Yorty.
Parker punked everybody because the files that were originally accumulated by the Intelligence Division, the old Red Squad of the LAPD and the open shop years, these were continued, but they focused on politicians and people in power. And this persisted long after Parker's death, well into the 70s and 80s. But to get back to the conditions at the time, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, which had been newly formed, came to LA at the beginning of the decade and was appalled to discover that 99% of the post-war housing boom, suburban homes, were totally off limits to Black people. They were appalled by the LAPD. Parker testified in this very arrogant way. He talked about the East Side. He talked about Latinos as these people who came from wild tribes in the mountains of Mexico. In 1963, there was a mass effort to bring tactics of the Southern Civil Rights Movement to LA and the formation of United Civil Rights Movement. The energy for it came out of a campaign by Congress of Racial Equality to integrate through nonviolent protests some of the suburbs. So this is the major instance of nonviolent protest and change, and it included an attempt to negotiate with LA's political and economic elites, and they were totally rebuffed, and the coalition collapsed. The next year, 2/3 of California's white voters voted to repeal California's new Fair Housing Act. In other words, it was a referendum on equality, and 2/3 of white voters rejected it. Just before the election, a report from UCLA economists predicted that 1965 would be witness the greatest employment growth and increase in wages in history. In December, a group of progressive economists and labor relations people headed by Paul Bullock and an ex-freedom writer known as named Bob Singleton, produced a massive 600-page report that showed that unemployment was increasing in the Black community almost as rapidly as it was disappearing in the white community. And they attributed part of this to the LAPD's campaign of rampant criminalization, often just for absolutely stupid things like vagrancy and loitering, which made a large number of particularly Black youth unemployable. They showed that Black women in the workforce unemployment rate was 60% because there wasn't a single Black secretary in a white-owned business in LA in those years. And I could go on, but won't, except to say that the argument that John and I make in the book is that the August Rebellion was not only inevitable, but in many ways it was necessary. And John could talk more about the kind of unity and cultural renaissance that emerged as the community stood up to violence from the LAPD, but also the fact that all other routes to significant change had been cut off.
Yes, well, there was
I see that we're joined now by Melina Abdullah.
Oh,
Melina, can you unmute? Unmute, please. And then let's ask Melina.
yes. Melina,
About-
are you unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Hi.
Okay, well,
How are you?
welcome, Melina. I'm Harold. I'm at the American Prospect, and we're talking on the anniversary of the Watts uprising of 1965. And I'm struck by all kinds of similarities and differences between then and now. And you are very much the personification of the now as the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, and dealing with many of the same issues, including the good old LAPD that was, you know, much of the precipitating force then, and again today, as are virtually every city police force, behind a new movement for social justice. Begin just by telling us, since you were in the news yesterday, what happened to you yesterday and your take on it, please, if you will.
Sure. So yesterday, LAPD came to my house, surrounded my home. There were dozens and dozens of officers and cars, and my initial assumption was they had to be on my block for something else. And my friend was here, or had just arrived, and he alerted me, comrade alerted me that there were police. And I argued with him. I was like, they're here for something else. And, you know, some time went by, I was on a phone call, and then I went to the window and looked out, and two officers ran across the street and pointed assault rifles at me in the window. And so then we heard over the loudspeaker, everyone in my address needs to come out with their hands up. So I have 3 children, single mom of 3 kids, and we were preparing actually to go to a press conference, which is why my comrade was coming to bring me to this press conference. And I was concerned for my children, so I put them in a room, you know, away from the windows, and proceeded to come out with my hands up. But I decided before I came out that it was important that I live stream so that people could see what was happening to me. And I figured if I were going to be shot by the police, I didn't want it to, you know, be done in a way that nobody saw it. I wanted it documented. And I also wanted backup. So I called for backup on Instagram, gave out my address, which I, you know, probably shouldn't have done. Well, I don't know if I shouldn't have done it, because people did show up, you know, and I wound up coming outside to see that dozens of my neighbors were outside and were there to make sure I was safe. And 2 of my neighbors refused to allow me to walk towards the police without them. And one actually put his body in front of mine. And afterwards, you know, I thanked him, of course. He said, well, you weren't going to be the one to take the first bullet. So when we got down to where the police were, about 2 houses down, they said that someone had called and said that me and my children were being held hostage on $1 million ransom. And, you know, that's why they were there. They didn't ask me my name. They didn't ask to see the children. They didn't ask me for ID. So I said they said, was I okay? I said yes, but they didn't ask me any other details. So I don't believe the police story, which is in the news, that they were just responding to a call. I did ask one of the officers if he knew who I was, because I'm pretty well known by LAPD. And they denied knowing who I was. Even though I would assume if you were coming to an address, it would say automatically who lives at that address, right? So it just sounds like a lot. I think I said on the video, this is a setup. I still feel like it was a setup. And I think it also proves, as we're talking about the brutality of LAPD, I think that the tactics have evolved, but they still continue to be one of the most brutal police forces in the country. If you think about what kind of trauma that was for my 3 children, and what kind of trauma it was for me, you know, to have experienced that. I think that they continue to engage in that same process of targeting organizers, of terrorizing Black folks who dare to stand up, which is what happened in Watts in 1965, which is why it wasn't just Marquette Fry who was arrested, but his mother and his brother who came out to be, you know, to aid him, right? The community became targeted because they came to his defense. And finally, and then I'll be quiet after this, I think it also underscores what we say, that for Black people, safety has never come through police. It comes through the building of community. It was my community who kept me safe from the police yesterday. And so, yeah.
Well, you live on a good block.
I live on a great block, yes.
That's
Harold, could I
important.
just add one
Yes.
thing?
Yes.
Harold, could I add one thing?
Yes.
At the end of the live stream, Melina turns the camera to herself and says, okay, everybody, you don't have to come to my house. Let's go to the press conference. Just totally cool and calm after this nightmarish experience. So Melina, congratulations on staying cool at the end of this. It's an incredible end to one of the scariest videos I've seen in a long time.
Well, let's talk a little more about the LAPD. When I was editing the LA Weekly, which I did from the late 80s through the early aughts, and therefore through the whole Rodney King beating and the acquittal of the cops who were, you know, caught filming, beating him, and uprising then. Is one of the things that Mike was talking about a little earlier, the impossibility of not just even changing the police, but just getting rid of the police chief, who at that point was Bill Parker's former driver, Daryl Gates, every bit as bigoted as Parker had been. It took heaven and earth and a commission headed by Warren Christopher and much else just to dislodge Gates. And I remember, and when we talk about it being among the most brutal, here's how it was the most entrenched. I remember when I was editing the Weekly during the time when much of the city was trying to get rid of Daryl Gates, Gates and his predecessors had actually intervened in mayoral elections and said who they were for, which struck me as a bizarre situation for someone who was nominally in the employ of the civilian city government. And we did a survey of the 20 largest cities in the United States. And only in Los Angeles was the police chief permitted, to intervene in municipal elections. Every other city regarded this as a totally ass-backwards a flow of legitimacy and power. But that's how screwed up the Los Angeles system was. That particular provision was later changed, but it's still indicative of how anomalously powerful the police were in Los Angeles.
Can I talk about the consent decree for a minute?
Sure. Yes.
For decades, the ACLU and community groups in South LA had been trying to set limits on the police, trying to get a civilian control board, trying to get the chief replaced. And finally, after the Rampart scandal, the Justice Department
and that's in
the federal in 1990, yes, in the late 90s. In 2001, a federal consent decree was finally imposed on the LAPD in response to an ACLU lawsuit and community groups, which required that the LAPD had to report to the federal judge and had to certify that they were not perjuring themselves in court testimony and not faking evidence. Well, I think that's a good policy. And this consent decree most federal consent decrees, extremely rare. There's 1,000 police departments in the United States, and at any moment in the old days before Trump, there were 10 or 20 under a federal consent decree. They're usually in effect for a year or 2 or 4 years. The LAPD consent decree lasted for 12 years, wasn't lifted until 2013. We did get a reforming police chief, Charlie Beck. He said now everything was going to change, and I think the official discourse from headquarters changed. Now we're community policing. Now we're taking seriously the idea of protect and defend. But certainly the culture of the rank and file seems like it has never changed, despite 12 years of federal supervision, despite reforming, or at least the rhetoric of reform coming from the new chiefs and from the mayor, and that's where we are today.
And that's really the case in most American cities, which almost every large city in the United States is governed by Democrats. That's who lives in cities, and they tend to appoint police chiefs who, by past standards, are relatively enlightened. But it doesn't seem to be the case that whatever the official policy is on top, that this ever trickles down to the streets as police do make their rounds. That seems to be, the transmission belt for somewhat profound historic reasons just isn't there. Mike, any thoughts on just this nature of policing as such?
Well, I think it's a mistake to focus on the culture of the rank and file. It's the institution itself. And until the police academy in Elysian Park is bulldozed down to the last brick, there won't be change. And Black Lives Matter, amongst several incredible achievements, have for the first time been to put this institutional question at the heart of the debate. That it's not a matter of good reforming chiefs or good cops on the beat. The institution and its relationship to property and power are the key, and it has to be changed root and branch. I got arrested in the 90s at a demonstration supporting the catering workers at USC who were on strike.
Right.
And all the cops who arrested me and all the jailers were all minority people. They treated the catering workers, these hardworking Latino people, just the same as the LAPD would have back in 1965. I mean, you can change the color of the skin of the officers. That's not the problem, and it's not a solution. And that's why it's so important that we continue to support BLM's intransigent stance about profound institutional change.
Right. Well, the very purpose of policing is in many ways what needs to change. I mean, it has its historic roots, as many have pointed out, in slave hunting and people whom it was trying to reassert someone's property interest in. That's not a very good route to have in establishing a very powerful institution. One of the things that strikes me from this book, and I want to remind our readers, we're talking to Melina Abdullah from Black Lives Matter, but also to the two authors of this new book, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s, Mike Davis and Jon Wiener, is a couple of things that are really striking in going through the history of social movements in Los Angeles in the 1960s. Two things that are very striking. How much of it came in places that the conventional histories don't look at it, really working class student bodies in colleges and in high schools, how young so many of the activists were. And then a term which did not exist in the 1960s, but certainly you document nonetheless the existence of in the 60s, and that is the intersectionality, the degree to which movements we think of as, you know, discrete and separate, gay and lesbian liberation, the movement of Mexican Americans and Chicanos, as they were then called, African Americans, and even young white teenagers on the Sunset Strip. You know, these were young movements, and these were movements which, you know, most of the time had a certain relationship that was positive with one another. So, and it's certainly very much the case today, as we see Black Lives Matter rallies that are incredibly multiracial, and as we see some attitudinal change really across much of the political spectrum. So talk a little bit about the substance of the movements, the youth of the movements, the convergence of these movements in the 1960s. So I had John and then Mike, and then I want Melina to sort of assess what's out there today.
I mean, I wasn't aware of this until Mike started writing about it, that the movements in LA, the most striking thing to me was the presence of not just college, junior college, but high school students, even junior high school students in South LA and in East LA, the high school blowouts of 69 and 70. These are the kids taking the initiative, demanding reforms in their own schools, both in the Latino neighborhoods and in South LA, and even in some of the white high schools on the West Side. On the college scene, you know, normally we think of it's Berkeley, it's Columbia, it's Harvard that are leading it. Not in LA. In LA, the largest mass arrests and the largest felony charges were at a school called Valley State. Now it's called Cal State San Fernando. What's it called now? Cal State Northridge. Right?
Cal State
called
Northridge.
Valley State in the olden days.
Yeah.
400 people were arrested in a building occupation, and there were 1,730 felony charges brought against 24 Black student movement leaders. It's the largest felony charges anywhere in the United States.
And they were demonstrating. They were demonstrating, were they not, for like a Latino studies?
They were demonstrating for Black studies and for kicking the racist coaches off of the football team. They'd occupied the president's office. This was mostly the work of the DA, Daryl Younger.
Evel.
Right. And of course, changing the DA is something very much on our agenda today, as Melina very well knows. Replacing the DA in Los Angeles with George Gascon is, one of the #1 goals we have in LA today. So
That's in the November election.
in the November election.
Yes. Yes. Mike, talk a little bit about all of these diverse movements, the degree to which they were together. And again, just, the centrality of working class minority young people and other young people, not minority, in the 1960s in Los Angeles.
Well, my favorite example is Carver Junior High School, which had an alliance of sorts with the Black Student Union at Southwest College. And people have been demanding for years a new community college to serve South Central area. And land had been bought, but not a single building constructed. And when it was finally opened, it was in every way a second-class campus compared to the shining new ultra-modern community colleges that were opening in the suburbs. And the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party played a major role at Southwest. They went on strike. People were arrested. So they turned to their allies, the 7th and 8th grade kids at Carver Junior High School, for support. And one of the things that's pertinent about the movements of the 60s today is how politicized and radical and important high school movements still are. We saw that years ago with the anti-Prop 187
Yes.
Movement, which led to blowing out of scores of high schools. We've seen it again and again. And it's happening right now in California with Black Lives Matter. What perhaps has been neglected, is exactly what you focus on, the intersectionality of this. When the East Side was blown out, so was Jefferson High School, LA's oldest traditional Black high school. That turned into a general strike of Black high schools a little later. Then you had West Side high schools going out in protest. At Venice High, you had a united front of Blacks, Latinos, and white students. And all the images of teenagers as being apolitical, being immature. I mean, all this stuff about this generation will never grow up to be real adults. I mean, all the kind of stuff we see today was, of course, applied in those days. Instead, you produce superb local campus organizers. And the high schools, in a way, became factories for the production of cadre for the Chicano Moratorium, for Brown Berets, for the Black Panther Party, and so many groups. The same kind of history, by the way, could be written for Chicago. There's an incredible mass strike of tens of thousands of students, Black students in Chicago in this period, but nobody's really paid any attention to this, with the exception of a few Black scholars.
And we see, we see today really a kind of generational radicalization that crosses racial lines among young people. It's clearly, become large enough that it's a real factor in American politics generally, which is quite remarkable. Melina, why don't you talk about the composition as you've experienced it of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, and youth involvement and general involvement across a whole range of categories.
Sure. So I think that there's a misunderstanding of Black Lives Matter as a millennial movement, right? Millennials are, of course, deeply involved in Black Lives Matter. Our three co-founders, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, are all millennials. However, when we think about the original members of Black Lives Matter, right? The ones who came to the first meeting, but were not, it wasn't our idea, right? There's a huge cross section in terms of generation, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of who we are, right? And so really Black Lives Matter, if you walk into a Black Lives Matter meeting, you meet one of the most diverse groups of Black folks you've probably ever seen assembled. Generationally, what we see is there's some in my chapter in particular in Los Angeles where we have membership that is 3 generations deep. And there's several families like that where it's a grandmother, a mother, and a set of teenage or young adult children. And it's really encouraging, what I've seen recently is, my children were raised, Kendrick Sampson, who's one of our strongest partners. He's an actor on a show called Insecure, and he's always with us in the streets. And he has an organization called Build Power. He calls the kids Black baby lives, right? They hate it, but I think that my children and many other children have really been raised in Black Lives Matter. So we're 7 years old. Black Lives Matter is 7 years old. So my children were 9, 6, and 3 when Black Lives Matter was born. And so they've been in BLM virtually all their lives for, some of them, right? Mm-hmm. Or for one of them. And so they've grown up, but I think that what we didn't fully factor in is what it means to grow up in a movement. And so one of the most exciting pieces that I see about organizing and activism right now is not the millennials, it's the Gen Zers, it's the kids, it's the ones that are, 18 and under, who are audacious and brilliant and visionary and don't give the system an inch, right? So what we've seen recently as Black Lives Matter, and I appreciate that assessment of it, Mike, we don't believe you can reform a system that evolves from slave catching. As ridiculous as it would be to say reform chattel slavery, that's as ridiculous as it is to say, let's reform slave catching, which policing descends from, right? And so that's why we say defund the police, take that money and reimagine public safety, right? Root public safety and community building, right? And so as we, defund the police has become this clarion call of this moment, right? Of this Black Lives Matter moment, right? We're pushing, and I think the grown-ups are pushing things like new policies that, say non-police responses to nonviolent calls. We're applauding, deploy DOT, Department of Transportation, instead of police for traffic. But these kids, some people are applauding this $150 million cut to the LAPD budget, which is literally a drop in the bucket, right? But these kids, they're saying, if there's one place police don't belong, it's in our schools. And when they're talking about defunding LAUSD police, they mean complete abolition of school police. And so they won a 35% cut to the LA school police. And the day after they won that, we were at our weekly protest in front of Jackie Lacey's office, which has grown from dozens of people to thousands of people.
And Jackie Lacey is the current district attorney of LA County. Just
the current district attorney who has the blood of 618 people on her hands. 618 people have been killed by police since she's been in office, and she refuses to prosecute those officers. So every Wednesday we're in front of her office saying she has to go. So these Black baby lives are there with us, and they're really called the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard. And So the day after they won this 35% cut to the LA school police, they were sitting around. The oldest was 16, the youngest was 10. And they get up and it's their turn to speak in front of thousands of people. And they take the mic and they look at their little group and they say, so we want to thank each other. We want to thank each other for the cut, right? We want to thank each other for organizing ourselves. And then they go on and talk about what that cut means and why that cut is important and why it's important to defund the school police. And then they end by saying, but 35% is not enough. $25 million is not enough. We're coming back because we want all of it. We're not stopping until we get all of it. And so I'm just so incredibly inspired by, like you said, not just young people, children. And I'd say it goes even further than the 1960s because that 10-year-old is in elementary school. He's not even in middle school yet, right? Elementary school to 16 years old is who won this the most significant cut of any policing unit in the county so far.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me when I was back editing the LA Weekly in the 1990s, in many ways, the whole modern immigrants' rights movement, I think, has one of its beginnings is something that Mike alluded to, which is the junior high and high school students who protested against Proposition 187 on the ballot in 1994, which was a measure that was designed to deny all public services to undocumented immigrants, including the right to go to K-12 school. So they started leaving the campuses and demonstrating, became the core of a massive demonstration held about a week or two before the November election in 1994. And really, many of the roots of the modern immigrants' rights movement begin right there with these kids then. So this may be, both a growing phenomenon, but also a kind of nice LA story, more than nice, an important LA story of youth that's radicalized by injustice. And responds to it, as you were suggesting, Melina, maybe a little more forcefully and a little more clearly than their nuanced elders. If people have questions for our panelists here, if you could send some in on our chat line, hit the chat box and write something at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we can go through some of those. One of the interesting things in the book that deals with the whole question of cross-generational is, as John and Mike point out, LA was kind of different in the 1960s too, in that there wasn't this total rift between the old left and the new left. And that was partly a function of the somewhat dissident LA Communist Party, which was headed by a remarkable woman named Dorothy Healy. Maybe Mike and John talk a little about that, because we're all used to the narratives about the lines that were drawn between old left and new left, and whatever wisdom the old left had, and never got transmitted. Talk a little about that.
Well, let me first add a footnote to what Melina said.
Sure.
There's a headline in the paper today that says studies have shown that a quarter of young adults in this country have contemplated suicide in the last 6 months. Resistance is life-giving. It really is. The Communist Party of, the Communist Party of...
That's the Black thing. Just giving you a cosign in what you said. I'm giving you a yeah.
You've been affirmed, Mike.
Yes.
And I see that in my own kids. I have two teenagers. So I'm a very old man, but I have two teenagers who go to an inner city high school, identify as Mexican. And these protests have taken them out of the depths of despair, believe me. They've been active in it. And they've also shown me that although the press attention goes to the white participation in the protests, it's the broad unity amongst people of color and immigrants, youth of color and immigrants in the high schools and on the campus that ultimately is the most significant here. And Melina's absolutely right about their intransigence. I can't get my kids to advocate voting for Biden as hard as I try. They want radical change in their lifetimes. Just briefly, the Communist Party of Southern California had in the war years, late war years, and a couple of years following up the war, was an organization of about 6,000 to 8,000 people, and it was everywhere. It was an effective political machine and base for organization on broad fronts. And in the McCarthy period, when its leadership was jailed and under prosecution, the local leadership, Dorothy Healy took the position that by whatever means necessary, the party had to return to public life. The party had to establish contacts with the new generation of radicals. At the same time, she began a root and branch rethinking of a lot of her ideas and past loyalties. I joined the Communist Party in 1968 with my wife, and same time Angela joined, because the Communist Party of Southern California had refused to endorse the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, instead had supported Prague Spring. And for this, Dorothy would later be deposed.
Right.
The party in Southern California had exceptional young leaders, Black leaders, two activists who have made the most profound impression on hundreds of lives, Franklin and Kendra Alexandra. We could say so much more. So no, there wasn't this generational gap or hiatus. And I must say that writing my share of the book, every moment of that was a conversation, or rather an argument with Dorothy, because we used to argue like cats and dogs. But she's certainly the intellectually and morally the prime influence of my life.
John, you want to talk about?
Well, actually, I have a question I've been wanting to ask Melina about the difference between the 60s movements and today's.
Sure.
In the 60s, especially the late 60s, there was really debilitating rivalry, internecine conflict, both within the Black radical movement and within the white radical movement. The conflict between Ron Karenga's US organization and the Panthers, the splits within the Panthers. It was the same thing on the left. The SDS had bitter factions. They were trying to kick each other out. In some ways, one of the greatest things that BLM has achieved is they really have unity. They really have solidarity. They don't have this kind of internecine rivalry, conflict, warfare. And so my question for Melina is, how did you do it?
Well, 7 years of work has helped us refine it. We're working on it because we've been committed to it for the last 7 years. I think centering it being a womanist movement, right? Black women at the center of the movement has taken a lot of ego out of it. I think that something that I don't always center, but others in the movement are better at it than I am, is the healing justice aspect of the movement, that what I am committed to and what I do attempt to practice is building a movement that's restorative, not depleting, right? So I think a lot of the infighting comes from just being stressed out, you know? So figuring out, even through, like, yesterday was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life.
Sure.
And immediately my team rolled up for me. Immediately my team, after we still did the press conference, we still did the protest at Jackie Lacey's office, right? And after we finished protesting in front of Jackie Lacey's office, 9 of our clergy members came and prayed on my front lawn for about an hour and a half, right? That when we got to Jackie Lacey protest, one of our comrades, Sikh brother, made sure that the kids, because my kids are involved in the movement too, had popsicles and chips and Gatorade to make them happy because they'd experienced such trauma. So I think understanding that the wellness of activists is important to keeping the movement well has also been a part of it. And so, you know, I'm grateful that it, and I want to be clear, it's not perfect, that there are times of conflict. But we've also learned that conflict doesn't mean blowing up the spot, right? Conflict means figuring out when to shut the door and allow ourselves to have that conflict. And we've learned a great deal from organizers who were active in the 60s. We have some of them who are part of Black Lives Matter now, who teach us, for instance, the practice of criticism and self-criticism, right? So you can't point the finger without having 3 fingers pointed back at yourself, right? So what is your role in the conflict, right? So I think all of that has been really, really helpful in building a sustainable movement.
I think one of the key differences you cited, Malia, the one that leaps out to me is all of the organizations of the New Left, most of them, were very male-led and sexist and testosterone charged, let us say. And your description of BLM in terms of many of the founders and such, that really is a world of difference, and it really suggests, you know, an experiential and a consciousness change that I think is provides a very good answer to John's question. Speaking of youth, on the questions that have come in during our talk, one person who I know was very active in and remains so in Charlottesville, Virginia, points out that the whole movement that began to petition for the removal of the statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were 2 young Black women who were high school students. So yet again, we have this remarkable generation, Gen Z, initiating movements with much larger impact. There was a significant cultural component. Let's talk about that, and then I think we need to go. But there was really a significant cultural component to the 60s left. We know in terms of popular culture, but it took all kinds of really interesting forms in South Central. And the alternative culture of Los Angeles generally. Mike was around then, I was around then, certainly in terms of an alternative press and alternative culture. So John and Mike, a little bit on that.
Well, in some ways, the underground newspaper, the LA Free Press, the FREEP, really was indispensable. I mean, at the time of the Watts riots, for example, the LA Times headlines read, "Anarchy must end," and then there were the big think piece about why are Blacks in Los Angeles so angry at the police. Their headline was, racial unrest led to Negro family failure. At the same time, the LA Free Press headline was, "The Negroes have voted." And now this was because the Freep had an editor, Art Kunken, who came out of the old left, out of the Socialist Workers' Party. He worked in community newspapers in East LA, and he had ties through CORE to Black LA. He knew writers in Black LA. So that was kind of the turning point for the LA Free Press that made it the largest and most successful, the biggest of all the so-called underground papers of the 60s. And it really was crucial given especially the nature of the LA Times in that era. Of course, KPFK was also a big left-wing institution, although it didn't start out that way, but it was largely because Dorothy Healy had a show called Communist Commentary, and all the people who weren't on the left quit KPFK in protest against Dorothy, and it became a left-wing radio station.
That's one way to do it, yeah.
Wasn't the original plan. So that was kind of the institutions of the counterculture in LA. But then, of course, there was free jazz, there was assemblage sculpture, and Mike knows a lot about that.
Yeah, Mike, talk about that, and Horace Tapscott, and what's been called the Watts Renaissance.
Well, let me first acknowledge that the single most important cultural change that occurred was the redefinition of a generation of East Side youth as Chicanos. Their rejection of hyphenated Americanism, because their whole existential experience was not that of being Italian American or Polish American. It was much closer to being Black Americans. And Chicanismo was, in some ways, a magnificently creative force. But above all, it created an identity that was much more congruent with the actual life experience of people. And it created a culture of resistance. I mean, this was very profound. The Watts Renaissance, John can probably talk more about it than that, but as a lifelong free jazz fan, Horace Tapscott was a pianist whose career would have been entirely different if he hadn't refused to leave LA. He had the same choice that people like, for instance, Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy had in LA, that if you really want a professional career, you move to New York. He refused to leave. He stayed working as a music teacher, and he built up a grassroots institution, his orchestra, which was literally open to anybody who wanted to play. And he was responsible for the alchemy that converted that into the movement anthem and the movement music of the period. And one of the things that I think is exceptional about LA is the important role that jazz musicians have played in Black resistance from the 1940s onward.
Okay. We're about hitting time. Melina, any closing thoughts on the future of this remarkable movement where you, among many others, have helped to build? Where do you see this going? Where do you see us going in the not too distant future?
Well, I see us continuing to grow and expand, to staying in the streets, and also to pushing policies. Like we're co-sponsoring only our third bill, which is a police decertification bill, right? I see us not falling for what I think many fell for in 2016, thinking that it was progress to move from protest to politics. I think everybody now understands that we have to have protest and politics, that it's important to vote in 2020, that we have to, of course, participate in the presidential election. We also got to vote this DA out of office. We have to vote for Measure J, which we just won, which, you know, getting it on the ballot. We haven't won it yet, but we got it on the ballot, which will divert some funds to prevention and intervention, county funds. So we have to vote. But I think that everybody is beginning to understand that no oppressed group has ever voted themselves into freedom. And so we have to stay in these streets, that this is not a one-off. We can't be active for, you know, a couple of months and think it's done. It has to be consistent and constant and building and pressure. And so I see that, you know, I know that we've recently been recognized first as the largest movement in national history, and now they're saying in global history. I think we're going to continue to grow. And I look forward to that, because I think that's how transformative change will take place.
All right. And Mike may want you to talk to his teenagers about the upcoming election.
And I'd love to. I'd love to. I'll get my teenagers to talk to your teenagers. How about
All right. Okay. That's how progress. That's how progress happens. John and Mike, any closing thoughts?
Yeah. Excuse me. This closing thought. The biggest cluster, the most dangerous cluster of COVID infections right now are in San Quentin prison. Earlier this year, we saw an extraordinary strike wave in the maximum security prisons. We must also keep the focus on prisons. And again, reform isn't enough. We need root and branch reconstruction, starting with the whole issue of mandatory life sentences, which is one of the most cruel and unusual punishments. So that's so important.
Yep. Yes, we are still the mass incarceration nation. And John, any closing thoughts about the 60s today or whatever?
I would just like to thank Melina for being with us today. I know she's got a busy, it's been a busy couple of days in her life. What she and Black Lives Matter have accomplished is truly historic. It is the largest political movement in American history, and it's not just in the streets of LA. It's in hundreds of little towns and cities across the United States. We've never seen anything like it. It's magnificent. So thanks to Melina and everybody who's been part of Black Lives Matter. It's so much better and so much bigger than anything we had in the 60s. I'm just in awe of what they've been able to accomplish.
Yes, and if you hadn't have asked that question, I would have asked that question about avoiding the kind of splits which were really helped destroy the New Left. So kudos to Black Lives Matter for many things, including that. So this concludes our discussion with Melina Abdullah, a terrific activist, and two terrific historians, Mike Davis and Jon Wiener, who have a new book out from Verso Press, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. LA is not on fire, but it is still one of the many places where movements for social justice are making real change. Thank you to you all, please also check us out at the American Prospect, www.prospect.org. Thanks again to all three of you and to our viewers. Good afternoon.